Hello, welcome to the Environmental Review Program presentation. I am the review coordinator and my name is Elizabeth, but I go by Betsy. Through Environmental Review, or ER, the Historic Preservation Office speaks for the historic properties that may be affected by the thousands of federal and state projects that are undertaken each year. Unlike other programs in our office, ER is not voluntary but is mandated by federal and state laws. Both state and federal statutes require the agency or designated applicant responsible for the project to consult with our office on how the project will affect historic properties. Though mandated by law, our role is advisory. The agencies retain all decision-making authority. How do we offer this advice? Through a process that begins when an agency decides that our office should review a proposed project. The agency or its designated applicant has a responsibility to prepare the information required for review. This includes information on historic properties that are on or visible from the project area, as well as project details. We then evaluate this information and provide comments on effects, if any, that the proposed project may have on historic properties, and these include archaeological sites as well as structures and buildings. One of two state laws that triggers our review is the Georgia Environmental Policy Act, or GEPA. This law dates to 1991 and was designed to protect cultural and natural resources of the state that may be impacted by a state agency's actions. As defined, a state agency is any department, board, bureau, commission, authority, or other agency of the state. Actions undertaken by local governments are also included if more than 50% of the total project cost is funded by a state agency, or if the project involves state funds of $250,000 or more. Only a small percentage of the projects we review are for compliance with GEPA. An example of one such project is the installation of noise barriers on Georgia 400. This was a Georgia Department of Transportation project that used state funds. The State Agency Historic Property Stewardship Program, or State Stewardship, is the second state law that we review under. It dates to 1998 and requires state agencies that own or manage land to identify historic properties, to create a management plan for these properties that determines and implements appropriate treatment, and to consider impacts to these properties that proposed projects may have. Here are some examples of state-owned or operated properties that the state stewardship regulations cover. Most of the state stewardship projects that we review involve the University System of Georgia. These include preservation plans, rehabilitation projects, and unfortunately, sometimes demolition of historic properties. The main federal law that we review under is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. Two sections of this law require federal agencies to consult with our office, which is the State Historic Preservation Office in Georgia. One of these is Section 110, which requires federal agencies that own land to be more proactive in managing their historic, structural, and archaeological resources by first identifying the historic properties and then developing a plan for the protection or management and use of these properties. It also is valuable when projects are identified, and the second section, Section 106, is triggered, which requires agencies to consider effects that their actions may have on historic properties. For example, the Historic Resource Survey for the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area was conducted for compliance with Section 110. One of the historic properties included in the survey is Allenbrook House, which is part of the early history of Roswell and is associated with Ivy Mill. A historic structures report prepared for this property allowed easier review for Section 106 when the National Park Service proposed interior renovations to the building for adaptive use as offices. The majority, or 98% of all projects submitted to HPD for review and comment are for compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. It requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions on historic properties, including structures and archaeological sites. This process, which encourages but does not mandate preservation, must be completed prior to the expenditure of federal funds or the issuance of any federal permits or licenses. So no ground disturbance or physical alteration should occur before Section 106 process is completed. What led to this legislation? When Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, its intent was to ensure that impacts of growth and development be considered as federal projects and programs were carried out. For historic properties, that was not just military forts and old mansions, but neighborhoods such as this one that was located near Georgia Tech in Atlanta. This example of urban renewal that happened in Atlanta was happening throughout Georgia and the United States. After World War II, there were increased pressures for development and more money coming from the federal government to do large municipal and semi-private projects in our cities and our towns, and these destroyed countless irreplaceable historic properties. From this came the National Historic Preservation Act, which established our current framework for the National Historic Preservation movement and programs. We review a variety of projects for compliance with Section 106. Some of these are obvious. Construction of highways and cell towers are examples of highly visible project types. Others are less so. The Corps of Engineers permits to dredge and fill in waterways, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation for new bank branches, installation of automated teller machines and foreclosed properties. Community Development Block Grant funds from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development are used by local governments in housing rehabilitation and many public improvements such as water sewer projects. All of these must comply with Section 106, and ER ensures that consideration of historic properties is part of the project. That said, Section 106 review is a process that has no mandated outcomes but ends in a negotiated conclusion. I won't go into the details, but here is a simple flowchart of the steps in the process. It is a consultation process that includes not only agencies in our office, but local governments and organizations or members of the public that have an interest in the project. The best results for this review process occur when it is initiated early in the project planning stage. Consultation and review should begin as soon as possible to ensure that participants are able to give meaningful comments regarding historic properties. One of the main steps in Section 106 review is determining if there are properties that may be affected by a project that are listed on or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, using the criteria that Gretchen explains in her presentation on the National Register program. A first step in identification of historic properties is to decide how far out you will look or the area of potential effects. This varies by project type but is defined as a geographic area within which an activity may cause changes to the character or use of historic properties. For example, a 300-foot tall cell tower may have a mile radius, while an interior rehabilitation project may just be the footprint of the building. If there are no historic properties in the project area, then the review for Section 106 is complete. After historic properties are identified, the next step is to determine whether the project will have an effect on these properties, and if so, whether it will alter the characteristics that make the property historic. Most projects that we review have no effect. Either there are no historic properties identified, or the nature of the project is such that there will be no effect. An example is the acquisition of a loan for an already constructed poultry house. We are seeing more of these now through the Farm Service Agency. Others may result in a finding of no adverse effect, such as installation of replacement sewer lines in an eligible historic district, or new roofs on historic houses when the work meets the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment of historic properties. Bill Hover speaks about the standards in his presentation on architectural review. However, when an adverse effect is found, the next step is to consider ways to avoid or minimize this adverse effect. As I noted, agencies are the decision makers in this process, but as in the other steps, public input is critical as agencies weigh historical values with project needs. An adverse effect occurs when the integrity of the historic property may be diminished by the action through alteration of what makes the property qualify for the National Register. Examples of adverse effects are demolition, which by definition is an adverse effect, removal of historic materials, inappropriate alteration, additions, or rehabilitation, that is, work that does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, or change in location. If it is not possible to avoid the adverse effect, this doesn't stop a project, but it is necessary to develop measures to mitigate the adverse effect before the project moves forward. The mitigation measures are formalized in a legally binding document called a Memorandum of Agreement. Mitigation is a balancing act that should result in a public benefit that counteracts the loss to the public of the historic property. Mitigation usually corresponds to the size and cost of the project plus the severity of the impact to the property. Typically, mitigation involves documentation of the resource both in narrative and photography, site interpretation, archaeological excavation, or public outreach projects. To give you an example of the review process, let's take a look at a type of project. Cell towers dot both the urban and rural landscape and vary in height, design, and also in whether their construction has visual or direct effects to historic properties. Over 10% of the projects that we receive are for construction of new cell towers. Since the towers are licensed through the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is required. These projects are challenging because they usually involve visual effects to historic properties, so determining mitigation measures after alternatives to minimize or avoid adverse effects are considered is more creative. An example is a cell tower that the City of Atlanta proposed in one of its parks. The park is a contributing resource to a nationally registered listed district, Mosley Park. In this case, it was determined that the cell tower would not only have a visual effect to the listed district, but a direct effect to the park. A design modification was proposed as a minimization measure. But the adverse effect was not avoided. For mitigation, HPD proposed preparation of a narrative that filled in details for the neighborhood between 1949 and 1954. The history and significance of the neighborhood through 1949 was well documented in the National Register nomination materials, and it seemed that the 1950s houses might tell an interesting story. The period covered by the mitigation report was highlighted by the transition of the formerly white Mosley Park neighborhood to a majority black neighborhood, and was accompanied by the development of newer suburban neighborhoods specifically for African Americans. Additional details and a PDF of the report are on our website. How many projects do we review in this program? In a given year, we receive around 3,000 submittals. Of these, most have no effect or no adverse effect to historic properties. Last year, we did have 71 findings of adverse effect and entered into 39 memoranda of agreement to mitigate those that could not be avoided. The bottom line, ER is most effective when the agencies involved are committed to following the review process and the public and local preservation groups take an active role.